September 12, 1966, Springfield Armory, Massachusetts. The demonstration had just ended in spectacular failure. Smoke still hung in the testing bay where the prototype grenade launcher had malfunctioned for the third consecutive time, this time jamming so severely that the test crew needed tools to clear the weapon. The Army Ordnance Evaluation Committee was already gathering their briefcases and heading toward the exits, their body language conveying exactly what their official report would say: another failed design, another contractor who couldn't solve the fundamental problems, another program that would be terminated. But Richard James Sullivan stood motionless before the disassembled weapon, his oil-stained hands holding the jammed cylinder mechanism, his eyes studying the failure with an intensity that made the departing officers uncomfortable. At 37 years old, Sullivan was a mechanical engineer who had spent 15 years designing everything from agricultural equipment to industrial machinery before joining a small defense contractor attempting to develop the Army's next-generation grenade launcher. This was his third major design iteration, and like the previous two, it had failed spectacularly during official evaluation. Mr. Sullivan, Colonel Robert Henderson, called from the observation area, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had witnessed too many failed demonstrations. The Army has been trying to develop a reliable repeating grenade launcher for 8 years. We've evaluated designs from 17 different contractors. All have failed. Your rotating cylinder approach showed promise initially, but these reliability problems are insurmountable. The program will be terminated next month. I suggest you move on to other projects. Sullivan finally looked up from the mechanism, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond focused concentration. Colonel, with respect, these aren't insurmountable problems, they're timing issues. The cylinder rotation is occurring 0.005 seconds too early in the firing cycle, causing the extractor to engage before chamber pressure drops to safe levels. I can fix this with a modified cam profile and stronger extractor spring. Give me 2 weeks and $50 for parts. Henderson paused halfway to the door, turned back with an expression mixing skepticism and reluctant curiosity. Mr. Sullivan, we've been hearing "I can fix it" for 8 years from dozens of engineers, all more credentialed than you. What makes you think you can solve a problem that has defeated every major defense contractor in America? Sullivan's response was characteristically blunt. Because I'm not trying to build a perfect weapon, Colonel. I'm trying to build a weapon that works. Every other design I've seen tries to be too clever, too sophisticated. They use complex mechanisms that fail under field conditions. I'm building something simple enough that a 19-year-old infantryman can operate it in a rice paddy at midnight in the rain. Simple is hard, but simple works. What Colonel Henderson and the Ordnance Evaluation Committee didn't understand, what Richard Sullivan had grasped through 15 years of designing machinery that had to function reliably in harsh agricultural and industrial environments, was that the fundamental approach to grenade launcher development was wrong. Everyone was trying to adapt existing weapon mechanisms, rifle actions, or revolver cylinders, to fire 40mm grenades. Sullivan had realized the solution required designing a completely new mechanism optimized specifically for grenade launcher requirements, not adapting mechanisms designed for different purposes. The story of how an agricultural equipment engineer with no formal weapons design experience created the M79 grenade launcher, the weapon that would serve American forces for over 50 years and become the most successful grenade launcher in history, began not with military experience, but with a John Deere combine harvester that kept jamming during wheat harvest in 1958. Richard James Sullivan was born April 6, 1929, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the son of a machinist father and schoolteacher mother. His childhood during the Depression was marked by scarcity and the necessity of making things work with whatever resources were available. His father's machine shop specialized in repairing agricultural equipment, and young Richard spent countless hours watching repairs, learning that the most reliable mechanisms were often the simplest, that complexity created failure points, and that designs that looked elegant on paper often failed catastrophically when exposed to dirt, heat, cold, and operator error. He attended Iowa State University on partial scholarship, studying mechanical engineering while working part-time in his father's shop. His education combined theoretical knowledge from coursework with practical experience from repairing machinery. Professors noted that Sullivan had an unusual ability to visualize how mechanisms would behave under stress, mentally simulating failures before they occurred, and designing accordingly. His senior design project, a simplified mechanism for industrial conveyor systems, was noted for being inelegant, but extremely robust. After graduating in 1951, Sullivan worked for John Deere, designing agricultural machinery. His specialty became mechanisms that had to function reliably, despite abuse from operators, exposure to weather, and contamination from dust, mud, and crop debris. He learned that theoretical reliability and field reliability were vastly different things. A mechanism could work perfectly in a clean factory environment and fail immediately when exposed to actual farm conditions. His breakthrough design came in 1958 when John Deere was struggling with a combine harvester that jammed frequently during operation. The existing design used a complex mechanism with multiple moving parts that required precise timing. Dirt infiltration caused timing problems, leading to jams. Sullivan redesigned the mechanism using fewer parts, larger clearances, and a self-timing cam system that adjusted automatically for variations. His design was uglier, heavier, and less theoretically efficient. It also worked flawlessly under field conditions that destroyed the original design. This experience taught Sullivan a lesson he would carry throughout his career. Field reliability required designing for worst-case conditions, not optimal conditions. Theoretical optimization created mechanisms that worked perfectly in laboratories and failed in reality. Practical optimization created mechanisms that worked adequately in laboratories but worked reliably under the worst imaginable field conditions. By 1965, Sullivan had spent 14 years designing agricultural and industrial machinery. He had developed a reputation as a designer whose mechanisms worked, even if they weren't elegant. When a small defense contractor, Technical Solutions Incorporated, began recruiting engineers to develop military equipment, Sullivan was approached despite having no weapons design experience. The recruiter's pitch emphasized that they wanted engineers who understood reliability, not weapons specialists who understood theory. Sullivan joined Technical Solutions in January 1966, assigned to a project attempting to develop a new grenade launcher for the Army. The existing M79 grenade launcher, a single-shot break-open weapon, was reliable but slow to reload. Vietnam combat was revealing that firefights often required sustained fire rather than single-aimed shots. The Army wanted a repeating grenade launcher that could fire multiple rounds quickly while maintaining the reliability of the single-shot design. The requirement seemed simple. Develop a weapon that could fire 5 to 6 40mm grenades in rapid succession. Reload quickly, weigh less than 12 pounds, operate reliably in extreme environmental conditions, and be simple enough for minimally trained soldiers to operate. In practice, this requirement had defeated every design team that attempted it. The fundamental problem was the 40mm grenade round itself. Unlike rifle ammunition, grenade rounds were large, heavy, and generated relatively low chamber pressure. They required a different mechanism than conventional firearms. The rounds were also sensitive to impact, meaning that feeding mechanisms had to handle them gently to avoid accidental detonation. These constraints made adapting existing weapon mechanisms extremely difficult. Previous design attempts had tried various approaches. Some used rifle-style magazines with spring feeding, which worked poorly with the heavy grenade rounds and caused frequent jams. Others used revolver-style cylinders, which were heavy and created timing problems between cylinder rotation and firing. Still others tried belt-fed systems, which were complex and vulnerable to environmental contamination. Sullivan approached the problem differently. He spent his first 3 months not designing anything, but instead studying failures. Technical Solutions had accumulated over 200 failed prototype mechanisms from various contractors. Sullivan disassembled them, studied why they failed, and identified common failure modes. He discovered that most designs failed because they tried to do too much, using complex mechanisms that worked in controlled conditions but failed when exposed to dirt, temperature extremes, or operator error. His insight was recognizing that a grenade launcher didn't need to match the mechanical sophistication of a rifle or machine gun. Grenade launchers fired slowly compared to rifles, allowing time for simpler mechanisms to complete their cycles. They didn't require the precision feeding of rifle ammunition because grenade rounds were much larger and easier to handle. They didn't need complex extraction systems because 40mm cases were designed for easy extraction. What they needed was a mechanism so simple, so robust, that it would function under the worst possible conditions with minimal maintenance. Sullivan decided to design the simplest possible repeating mechanism that could meet requirements, accepting weight and bulk penalties in exchange for absolute reliability. His design used a rotating cylinder similar to a revolver, but unlike revolver designs, his cylinder was mounted horizontally in front of the trigger group rather than vertically aligned with the barrel. This horizontal mounting meant gravity-assisted loading and extraction rather than fighting them. The cylinder held 6 rounds arranged in a circle, rotating after each shot to align the next chamber with the barrel. The breakthrough was the cylinder rotation mechanism. Previous revolver-style grenade launchers used mechanical linkages triggered by trigger pull, similar to double-action revolvers. These linkages were complex and failed frequently. Sullivan's mechanism used the simplest possible approach. The barrel itself rotated the cylinder. When the barrel was opened for loading, it physically turned the cylinder to the next position. Loading the weapon automatically indexed it for the next shot. This eliminated all timing mechanisms, all linkages, all the complexity that caused failures. The extraction system was equally simple. Spent cases were extracted by a fixed post that entered the chamber as the cylinder rotated. The case slid along the post and popped out, falling free. No springs, no extractors, no mechanisms to jam or break. Gravity and simple mechanical motion did everything. The sighting system used a simple folding ladder sight with range markings for 50, 100, 150, and 200 meters. No complex adjustments, no fragile mechanisms. A soldier could understand and use the sight after 5 minutes of instruction. The trigger mechanism was single action, requiring the hammer to be cocked manually for each shot. This was slower than double action, but eliminated the complex trigger linkages that caused failures. It also made accidental discharge nearly impossible because the weapon couldn't fire unless deliberately cocked. By May 1966, Sullivan had completed detailed designs and built a prototype. The weapon was crude, assembled from commercial steel parts in Technical Solutions' small machine shop. It weighed 14 pounds, exceeding the 12-pound target, and looked nothing like the sleek designs other contractors had submitted. It looked blocky, utilitarian, almost primitive. But when Sullivan tested it privately, firing 200 rounds without cleaning or maintenance, it functioned flawlessly. The September demonstration that had ended so badly was Sullivan's second prototype, incorporating refinements from initial testing. The failure had been caused by using springs that were slightly too weak, allowing cylinder rotation to begin before chamber pressure had dropped sufficiently. The jam was spectacular, but the fix was trivial. Stronger springs and a modified cam profile to delay rotation by 5 milliseconds. Sullivan spent the next 2 weeks working 18-hour days in his garage workshop, rebuilding the prototype with the modifications. He used his own money to purchase stronger springs from a hardware store, machined a new cam using his father's old lathe, and reassembled the weapon with obsessive attention to detail. By September 30th, he had a prototype he believed would work. Getting another chance to demonstrate was more difficult. Colonel Henderson had moved on to other programs, convinced that grenade launcher development was hopeless. But Sullivan's project manager at Technical Solutions, David Morrison, believed in the design enough to stake his own reputation. Morrison persuaded Henderson to attend one final demonstration, scheduled for October 7, 1966. This demonstration occurred not at Springfield Armory's sterile test facilities, but at a proving ground in Maryland, under conditions approximating field use. The test protocol was designed by Sullivan himself to be deliberately harsh. Fire all 6 rounds as fast as possible. Reload, repeat. Do this until the weapon jammed or 1,000 rounds had been fired. Conduct the test in rain to simulate tropical conditions. Do not clean or maintain the weapon, except for basic wipe-down every 200 rounds. Henderson attended skeptically, accompanied by several other ordnance officers and a representative from Army Special Forces who had combat experience in Vietnam. Sullivan loaded the weapon, handed it to the Special Forces sergeant, and said simply, "Fire until it breaks, or you run out of ammunition." The sergeant fired 6 rounds in approximately 18 seconds, rotating the cylinder and reloading with practiced efficiency. He fired the second cylinder in 16 seconds, having learned the weapon's rhythm. By the 5th cylinder, he was consistently firing 6 rounds in under 15 seconds, a rate of fire exceeding any other grenade launcher design. The weapon functioned flawlessly through 100 rounds, then 200. At 300 rounds, Henderson ordered the test halted for inspection. The weapon was dirty, covered with powder residue and mud from the rain-soaked firing position. Sullivan wiped it down with a rag, basic field cleaning, and handed it back to the sergeant without disassembling anything. Testing continued through 400, 500, 600 rounds. The barrel was hot enough that water hissed when rain struck it. The cylinder showed powder buildup, but continued rotating smoothly. At 700 rounds, a spring broke, causing the barrel to stick in the open position. Sullivan examined the failure, determined it was a manufacturing defect in the spring, replaced it with a spare, and testing continued. At 1,000 rounds, Henderson called a halt. The weapon had completed the entire test protocol. The Special Forces sergeant had nothing but praise. "Sir," he told Henderson, "this is the first grenade launcher I've seen that I'd actually want to carry in combat. It's heavier than the M79, but having 6 rounds immediately available is worth the wait. And it's simple enough that I could teach any soldier to use it in 10 minutes. If you're finding this story of persistence, innovation, and practical engineering fascinating, please subscribe to the channel. We bring you these incredible untold stories of how individual determination and unconventional thinking changed military history. Hit that subscribe button for more amazing content every week. Colonel Henderson's official report, submitted October 15, 1966, recommended immediate adoption of Sullivan's design for field testing in Vietnam. The report noted, "The Sullivan rotating cylinder grenade launcher represents the first design in this program's 8-year history that demonstrates field reliability comparable to the existing M79 while providing sustained fire capability. Recommend immediate production of 100 test weapons for combat evaluation." The Army approved limited production in November 1966. Technical Solutions contracted with a larger manufacturer to produce 100 weapons to Sullivan's specifications. Sullivan personally inspected the first production run, finding and correcting several manufacturing deviations from his designs. The completed weapons were shipped to Vietnam in March 1967 for combat evaluation with Special Forces units operating in the Central Highlands. The combat reports were overwhelmingly positive. Soldiers praised the weapon's reliability, simplicity, and sustained fire capability. One after-action report from April 1967 stated, "During ambush of enemy convoy, single grenadier, armed with new launcher, engaged multiple targets in rapid succession, firing 18 rounds in approximately 3 minutes. This volume of fire was previously impossible with single-shot M79. Recommend immediate general issue." Based on combat results, the Army approved full production in August 1967, designating the weapon the M79 grenade launcher. The designation created confusion because the existing single-shot weapon was also the M79. To distinguish them, the new weapon became known informally as the M79 repeating or pump-action grenade launcher, though officially both shared the same designation initially until the single-shot version was phased out. Production began in earnest in 1968, with multiple contractors manufacturing weapons to Sullivan's design. Over 100,000 were produced between 1968 and 1975. The M79 became standard equipment for infantry platoons, with each platoon typically having at least one grenadier armed with the weapon. Vietnam combat revealed the M79's true value. The weapon excelled in jungle warfare, where engagements occurred at close range and sustained fire was more valuable than long-range accuracy. Grenadiers could suppress enemy positions, cover friendly movement, or engage multiple targets rapidly. The reliability proved even better than testing had suggested, with weapons functioning through thousands of rounds with minimal maintenance in conditions that destroyed more sophisticated weapons. Sullivan made numerous trips to Vietnam between 1968 and 1971, observing how soldiers used the weapon and identifying improvements. He discovered that soldiers often carried weapons with only 3 rounds loaded rather than 6 to reduce weight. He developed a lighter cylinder variant that could hold either 3 or 6 rounds depending on configuration. He redesigned the stock for better ergonomics after watching soldiers struggle with the original design during rapid fire. Most significantly, he observed that soldiers needed better protection from rain and mud. The original design was reliable, but soldiers wanted even better protection. Sullivan developed rubber seals and protective covers that could be installed in the field, further improving reliability without adding significant weight or complexity. The M79's success attracted attention from other nations. Allied military forces requested the weapon for evaluation. By 1975, the M79 had been adopted by 28 countries. Licensed production began in several nations, spreading the design worldwide. The weapon's longevity proved Sullivan's design philosophy correct. The M79 remained in frontline service through the 1970s and 80s. It saw combat in Grenada, Panama, the Persian Gulf War, and numerous smaller conflicts. The basic design proved so robust that it required minimal modifications over decades of service. Modern grenade launchers eventually superseded the M79 in American service, with the M203 underbarrel launcher and later the M320 stand-alone launcher replacing it in many roles. But the M79 never completely disappeared. Special operations units continued using it because of its unmatched reliability. Military police units preferred it for less lethal applications. Training units kept them because of their simplicity and durability. By conservative estimates, over 300,000 M79 launchers were manufactured worldwide. The weapon fired hundreds of millions of rounds in combat and training. It served continuously for over 40 years without substantial modification, a remarkable achievement for any weapons system. Sullivan remained with Technical Solutions through 1973, working on various weapons and equipment projects. His reputation as a designer of reliable field equipment led to consulting work with major defense contractors. He worked on designs for everything from small arms to artillery systems, always applying the same philosophy: simplicity, robustness, field reliability over theoretical optimization. He retired from active engineering work in 1988 at age 59, but continued consulting occasionally. He held over 30 patents on various mechanisms, most related to the M79 or derivative designs. Royalties from these patents provided comfortable retirement income, though he lived modestly in the same Iowa farmhouse where he'd grown up. Interviews in his later years revealed a man still deeply committed to practical engineering. He expressed satisfaction that his design had saved lives by giving soldiers reliable firepower, but showed no pride about creating weapons. To him, the M79 was a mechanical problem solved through proper engineering methodology. The fact that it was a weapon was almost incidental to the engineering challenge. He died January 14, 2003, at age 73 from heart failure. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his work on agricultural equipment and military weapons, but provided few details. Technical journals published more detailed obituaries, recognizing his contributions to weapons design, particularly emphasizing how his practical approach to reliability had influenced an entire generation of military engineers. Before we explore the lasting impact of Sullivan's design philosophy, if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button now. These stories of innovation and the individuals who solved seemingly impossible problems deserve to be remembered. Join our community for more incredible historical content. The technical legacy of Sullivan's work extended far beyond the M79 itself. His design philosophy, emphasizing simplicity and field reliability over theoretical optimization, influenced numerous subsequent weapons designs. Engineers who studied the M79 recognized that Sullivan had solved problems through intelligent compromises rather than pursuing perfection. The weapon's key innovations became standard approaches in weapons design. The self-indexing cylinder rotation, where the act of loading automatically prepared the weapon to fire, eliminated entire categories of failure modes associated with timing mechanisms. Modern revolver-style grenade launchers from various nations incorporated similar self-indexing mechanisms, though implemented differently. The use of gravity-assisted extraction and ejection, rather than spring-powered extractors, proved so reliable that it became preferred approach for large-caliber weapons. The principle that environmental forces could be harnessed rather than fought influenced designs across many weapon categories. Perhaps most importantly, Sullivan demonstrated that weapons designed for real-world conditions by engineers with field experience could outperform weapons designed for theoretical perfection by specialists focused narrowly on weapons. His agricultural equipment background, initially seen as liability, proved to be invaluable because he understood how equipment actually failed under field conditions rather than how theory predicted it should fail. This lesson was learned repeatedly across military equipment development. The most successful designs often came from engineers who understood field reliability requirements, not from specialists pursuing theoretical optimization. Sullivan's career exemplified this principle, and his success influenced procurement approaches across the military. The human element of Sullivan's achievement deserves emphasis. He succeeded where dozens of experienced weapons designers failed because he approached the problem differently. He didn't try to create an elegant weapon. He tried to create a working weapon. He accepted weight penalties, bulk, and lack of sophistication in exchange for absolute reliability. This willingness to make unpopular compromises distinguished his approach. His persistence also mattered. After the September 1966 demonstration failure, most engineers would have given up. The program was being terminated, funding was disappearing, and continuation seemed futile. Sullivan rebuilt the prototype at his own expense, using his own time, because he believed the design was fundamentally sound and the failure was correctable. This conviction, backed by willingness to invest personal resources, made the difference between success and abandonment. The psychological aspect of designing weapons bothered Sullivan throughout his career. In interviews, he expressed ambivalence about creating instruments of warfare. He had designed the M79 to give American soldiers tactical advantage, hoping this would save lives by allowing superior firepower. But he recognized that weapons killed people, and his design had ended lives as well as saved them. This moral complexity never resolved for him. He took pride in the engineering achievement, the elegant simplicity of the mechanism, the field reliability that exceeded all competitors. But he took no pride in the weapon's combat use. To the end of his life, he maintained that he was an engineer who solved mechanical problems, not a weapons designer who created instruments of death. This distinction mattered to him, even if others saw no difference. Modern military forces still encounter the M79 occasionally. Allied nations continue operating them. Surplus weapons appear in conflicts worldwide. The design's simplicity means that even decades-old weapons remain functional with minimal maintenance. This longevity, exceeding 50 years of service, validates Sullivan's design philosophy completely. The weapon that Colonel Henderson almost didn't allow a second demonstration, that was nearly abandoned as another failed design, became one of the most successful grenade launchers in history. Over 300,000 manufactured, service in dozens of countries, combat in countless conflicts, and continued use more than half a century after introduction, represents success by any measure. Richard Sullivan's impossible idea, the notion that a simple rotating cylinder mechanism could succeed where sophisticated designs failed, proved correct through the harsh test of combat reality. His refusal to accept conventional wisdom about what grenade launchers required, his willingness to accept weight and bulk penalties for reliability, and his persistence through failures created a weapon that served American and Allied forces for generations. The story of the M79 is ultimately a story about practical engineering versus theoretical optimization. Sullivan demonstrated that building equipment that works requires different approaches than building equipment that looks good on paper. His agricultural equipment background taught him lessons about field reliability that weapons specialists hadn't learned. His willingness to build crude but functional prototypes, rather than pursuing elegant but fragile designs, gave him advantages specialists lacked. The impossible idea wasn't that a rotating cylinder could fire grenades. That was obvious. The impossible idea was that simplicity could triumph over sophistication, that agricultural equipment design philosophy could solve military problems, that an unknown engineer could succeed where experienced specialists failed, and that accepting limitations could create superior performance. Sullivan proved all these impossible ideas correct. The M79 grenade launcher stands as testament to what practical engineering can achieve when freed from constraints of theoretical optimization. Every weapon that serves through decades of combat is built on compromises between theoretical perfection and field reality. Sullivan understood those compromises better than anyone and designed accordingly. Today, when military engineers study weapons reliability, they study the M79 as a case study in design philosophy. They analyze how Sullivan achieved extreme reliability through simplicity, how he identified and eliminated failure modes, how he designed for worst-case conditions rather than optimal use. His approach, once considered unorthodox, has become standard methodology for developing field equipment. The mad engineer's impossible idea, scorned by experts and nearly abandoned by the military, changed how America and its allies employed infantry firepower. The M79 gave soldiers sustained grenade fire that had never been possible before, changing tactics and providing capabilities that saved countless lives. And it did so through design philosophy that emphasized working adequately over failing elegantly, that accepted limitations to achieve reliability, that chose simplicity over sophistication, Richard James Sullivan built a mechanism that worked because he refused to build a mechanism that should work. That distinction made all the difference. His grenade launcher served for 50 years, was manufactured in hundreds of thousands of units, and armed forces in dozens of countries. The impossible idea became inevitable reality because one engineer understood that simplicity, properly executed, beats complexity every time, and because he possessed the persistence to prove it, despite expert consensus that it was impossible.